Well, as some of you know, our family is headed for warmer weather this week. Not that I'm trying to rub it in. But one of the things that I plan to do while we're away is I'd like to do some reading. Now, my wife is constantly encouraging me to read more fictional books, fictional material. Apparently, I need more of that in my life. But the truth is that what I really like to read are things like biographies. I just think there's something fascinating and amazing about being able to read from the life of someone and to look in kind of from the outside in. There's such value in being able to learn lessons from the life of those who have gone before us. And I know for myself that this has profoundly affected my own life and ministry. Now, obviously, I have present-day preachers that I look up to and admire. My friend Bill DeYoung being at the top of that list. But the truth is that the preachers that have impacted my life the most are preachers who lived many years ago. Those who've gone before. I think of men like George Whitefield, Charles Spurgeon, the late Martyn Lloyd-Jones. In fact, last year I was able to read a biography about the life of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. He was a very prominent preacher. He preached in the 20th century in the well-known Westminster Chapel in London. But I discovered something about Lloyd-Jones that I didn't know before. As I read this book, I learned that he had abandoned a promising career in medicine in order to pursue ministry. Now, a lot of people questioned him about that decision. They said, I could understand if you left behind like a career as a bookie or as a loan shark or some other kind of questionable occupation. I could understand why you would leave that to pursue ministry, but why leave medicine? Why leave doing something good? And Lloyd-Jones had the following response. He said this. He said, if you knew more about the work of a doctor, you would understand. He said, we spend most of our time rendering people fit to go back to their sin. He said, I saw men on their sickbeds. I spoke to them of their immortal souls. They promised grand things. Then they got better, and back they went to their old sin. I saw I was helping these men to sin, and I decided that I would do no more of it. He said, I want to heal souls. Now, I'm not suggesting tonight that everybody should abdicate the medical profession in order to pursue ministry. But what I think is interesting about the life of Lloyd-Jones is that he was not able to separate who he was from what he did. He was in the medical profession. He was working as a doctor. But he looked at people and he looked deeply into who they were, and he recognized that there was a core issue, a core problem, and it wasn't their physical brokenness. It was their spiritual brokenness. It was the fact that they were separated. They were without Christ. And so he felt this tremendous call, this tremendous pull to pursue ministry and to point them to the great physician, the one who could truly heal. Lloyd-Jones would go on to say that if people have sick bodies but healthy souls, I know they will be fine in the end. But if they have healthy bodies and sick souls, then I know that they are on the pathway to hell. That was the worldview, and a Christian worldview that shaped his life. That made every encounter, every conversation that he had, every meeting that he had, it made it meaningful because he recognized how much was at stake. He understood that souls were hanging in the balance, and it drove his ministry. I want to ask you tonight, is that what drives our ministry here as a church? Do we have a burden on our hearts for lost souls? Now, maybe you say, yeah, obviously we do. Of course, we are a church. And perhaps you want to point to specific things that we do. You say, well, we're involved with Christians Against Poverty, and we're involved with the work of Micah House, and we volunteer at the Hamilton Dream Center, and you say we're reaching out to the underprivileged. And those are all beautiful things. They're great things. They are what the church should be doing, showing the love of Jesus Christ. But the question remains, are we burdened for people's souls? Is that what drives us as a church? Do we have a heart for those who are lost? Do we recognize, along with Lloyd-Jones, that we can dress people and we can feed people and we can give them homes and we can do all sorts of good things and yet not really see the big problem, the core issue that people face? Well, tonight, in the time that we have, I want to focus on a Christian doctrine, on a Christian teaching that deals with the core issue, with the problem of humanity. And that is the doctrine, the teaching of original sin. Now, I must say that it's not a terribly popular doctrine. Anytime that you come to someone and you present a teaching that says, well, you are inherently broken, that you are inherently corrupt, as opposed to coming to someone and saying you're inherently good and well, it tends not to go over that great. But we're not asking tonight if it's a popular doctrine. The question that we're interested in is it a biblical doctrine? And I think when we look at Romans 5, we'll see that it is. This is obviously not the only passage that teaches it, but it's certainly a key passage. So I want to look at Romans 5 as we consider this question, but I want to begin by offering you a definition of original sin. Here's the definition that I'm going to work with tonight. The condition of sinfulness that all persons share, and that is caused by the fall into sin of Adam and Eve. This condition involves the loss of original righteousness and the hereditary corruption of all humanity. So just to be clear, the doctrine of original sin is not referring specifically to the first sin of Adam and Eve. But what it's referring to is the condition, the corrupt nature that is brought about by their disobedience. It's highlighting, you could say, the result of their action. The Bible teaches that God made the world good, that people were in the image of God, that they walked in righteousness and holiness, that they knew God, that they loved God. And they were created, very importantly, with the freedom to do so. But when Adam and Eve abused that freedom in order to rebel against God, it fundamentally changed humanity. Things were no longer good. The image of God was distorted. Righteousness and holiness were gone. They were no longer striving to know God and to love God. And if you look at Romans chapter 1, Paul starts with this. Paul provides a very visual example of what this fall looks like. People suppressing the truth, their hearts being darkened, exchanging the truth of God for a lie. It's a picture of the sinful condition. In Romans 5, it's like Paul is circling back to this issue, and he wants to deal with kind of the cause and the effect of original sin. And that's what he's doing when he starts in Romans 5, verse 12. He says, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. Paul wants to highlight the fact that the cause of our original sin is the disobedience of the one man, pointing to the sin of Adam and Eve. But then he's saying that with that sin came also the effect. and the consequence of death. The word that Paul uses in Romans 5, verse 12, when he says sin entered the world, is a word that really has the idea of it invaded. That sin invaded the world. And because they were now, you could say, contaminated, everything that flowed from them is contaminated. And that includes you, and that includes me. Now, this teaching has two important applications for the Church of Christ, and for you and for me. The first is this, that it eliminates pride. There's just no room for pride in the Christian life because we all enter the world with the same condition. We all enter the world as sin. We don't look down on anyone as if we are better than them somehow. But the second thing is that it drives us to point people to the hope of Jesus Christ, to the hope offered in the gospel. When you go through this passage as we did, even from 12 to 21, you notice that Paul is doing two things. He is holding up Adam, but he's holding up Christ. Throughout the passage, he is holding up the problem, he is holding up the solution. He's holding up the sickness, he's holding up the cure. But we need to recognize that he's not just holding them up as individuals, he's holding them up as representatives. Douglas Moo, who's a fantastic New Testament theologian, he has this to say. He says, all people, Paul teaches, stand in relationship to one of two men whose actions determine the eternal destiny of all who belong to them. Either one belongs to Adam and is under sentence of death because of his sin or disobedience, or one belongs to Christ and is assured of eternal life because of his righteous act or obedience. The question is one of, who is your representative? Is it Adam or is it Christ? Now, the objection that many people have against this teaching, against this doctrine, is that they say, well, I'm not sure if it's fair. They say, why is it that Paul says all sin? I wasn't there with Adam. Why would I be held guilty for what he did? But we need to recognize that this is not an inconsistency on God's part. God says to Adam, if you sin, this is what's going to happen. The consequence is physical, spiritual death. And the other thing we need to recognize is that the argument works both ways. And that's why Paul comes back to this thought in verse 18 and 19. I just want to read that again with you. He says, consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, here holding up Adam, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people, holding up Christ. Just as through the disobedience of the one man, the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous. The point that Paul is making is this. If you want to say, well, I wasn't with Adam, I don't want to be connected to his guilt and to sin and to death because I wasn't part of that act, then you're also not going to be connected to Christ and to enjoy his grace and his life and the peace that he offers, because under the same argument, you're not part of that act. Paul wants to go back. That's why he uses the language of all people. It's corporate language. He's saying you're either part of that representation of Adam, or you're part of that representation of Christ. Let me offer you maybe an illustration. If you were to go back in time to about, let's say, the 1940s, during the time of the Second World War, and let's say you were looking at the nation of Germany, saying that you were perhaps born into that nation, you would be someone who would have as your representative at that time Adolf Hitler. He would be the figurehead, the representative for that nation. And when he declared war, that had implications for everyone in that nation. When he declared war, it didn't just mean that Adolf Hitler was at war. It meant that the country was at war. And it meant that everyone in that country would face the consequences that come with war. Things like suffering and death and destruction. And if you happen to be born into the nation of Germany during the time of the war, you, by virtue of your birth, by virtue of your citizenship in that country, you would be born at war. By no other virtue other than your birth and your citizenship, you would suffer the implications of war, things like the destruction and the death and everything else that comes with war. When you're born into this life, you, by virtue of your birth, have citizenship in this world and have Adam as your representative. And you're born into a people that are at war. A people that have gone to war with God, that have rebelled against God. And what we see all around us are the implications of being at war with God. Suffering and brokenness and death and everything else that comes with sin. Now, the only way you would have solved the problem of let's say, living in Germany at that time during the World War, the only way you could solve that would be to flee, to seek refuge somewhere else, to pursue another place, to start a new life, to look for citizenship in another country where someone else could represent you. And the only way to flee the representation of Adam is to look for citizenship, not in this world, but citizenship in heaven. And it's to seek refuge somewhere else with Christ as your head, with Christ as your representative. I want to ask you tonight, when you look at the world, do you see a world that's at war? Do you look around you and see a world full of people who are broken, people who are lost, people who are desperately in need of healing? When we really, really grasp the problem with life and with people, then suddenly every encounter that we have, every conversation that takes place, every meeting that we have has incredible significance. Every single moment is an opportunity to point people to the great physician, to point people to the opportunity to take your citizenship and place it in heaven, to replace Adam with Christ, and to experience tremendous, tremendous peace. Let's take time to pray together.